Of Isaiah. I'm sorry, with the book of Joshua. Oh, good. Will you be one or two? Two people? One or two? One. All right. I'll put his name down. I know who he is. So far we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. What time is it? 6:30. 27 people. That'll be a nice group, and if we get more, that's good too. So everybody bring a dish. Vegetable, salad, meat, whatever you want to eat, because the food we will eat will be what you all bring. But no bread, no matter how good Mrs. Haddon's bread is, no bread. Because on Passover, you're not supposed to have bread. You eat matzah instead. We'll supply the matzah, which is the symbol of the season, the bread of affliction, which is utterly tasteless. It is the bread of affliction. It's supposed to torture you. However, if you put butter and salt on it, like anything else, it's very good. I mean, I could put butter and salt in this and eat it. It'd be very good. So. All right, so it'll be at 6:30, Saturday night, the 23rd of April. And we'll start promptly at 6:30. We'll be out by 9. All right, now we're doing the book of Joshua. Oh, by the way, I'm told that Sunday is your birthday. Catherine's birthday. The Lord told me, He came to me in a dream. And so Catherine's father is here to help celebrate her birthday. So we welcome you.
Thank you.
Always welcome. You have a wonderful daughter, and I'm sure she has a wonderful father. But I don't know that out of evidence yet, but I would find out if I got to know you better. You must have been doing something right to produce her.
Oh, thank you.
Now, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They're a unit. They're called the Deuteronomic history. Why is that? Because, and it gets confusing, because the order in which we have our books in the Bible are not necessarily the order in which they were written or came to light. I've tried to make clear that the book of Deuteronomy, although traditionally ascribed to Moses, from the scholarly point of view from which this course is taught, rather than a Christian or Jewish point of view in particular, I try to bring the wisdom of those two traditions to bear. But when I teach at a university, and I taught this for 40 years at the university, you don't teach from a church perspective, certainly not from a particular denomination's perspective. You're teaching, not only passing on the Bible to people so they become familiar with it. It is, after all, the foundation of our whole civilization. Our ideas of morality and ethics and all are developed out of the Bible. It doesn't mean we do everything it says to do in the Bible, but that whole idea that you serve God by being a certain way with your fellow human beings. Remember, Jesus summed up the purpose of religion. He quoted from Deuteronomy, love the Lord your God, and Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. You love God by loving your neighbor. You honor God by honoring your neighbor because we are created in the image of God. It means we are infinitely precious. We are undefinable. We are irreducible to a definition. We have infinite possibilities in us. We certainly have an infinite yearning for God. And that's what's human in us. This self-transcendence, this reaching beyond ourselves to the infinite and the eternal. So we are finite beings, limited beings, but within us we are like broken off pieces of the infinite, which is God. And the purpose of religion is to get ourselves reconnected to our origins and our destiny, the infinite and the eternal one. So that's how you sum up religion, and that was unique to the Israelites in those days. That you honor God by being a certain way with your neighbors, kind, compassionate, just. Human decency is a kind of religion. Well, the book of Deuteronomy was discovered around 620 BC, when, and the stories in the book of Kings, when they are refurbishing the great temple of Solomon that he built in Jerusalem some 400 years earlier. After 400 years, it needs repair. And they're working on it, and the high priest gives a book to the king's agent. And he says, read that to the king. We just discovered it in the closet under the floorboard somewhere. And the king reads it. He says, wow, that's Moses wrote this. And we read the book of Deuteronomy. At least we skimmed it. It's a collection of speeches by Moses to the Israelites. He had taken them out of Egypt in about 1290 BC. He'd led them for 40 years in the wilderness, in the desert, going to Mount Sinai and coming down with the Ten Commandments. And then at the end of his life, the story says he wrote this book. It's a collection of admonitions. How do you live when God is your king? And it has three major points to make. One is absolute monotheism. There is only one God, and to worship any other God is a terrible heresy. And God will be furious. Second, all worship must be centralized, quote, in the place where I cause my name to dwell, unquote. Doesn't say where. But when they discovered it in the temple, they assumed Moses meant the temple of Jerusalem, which of course hadn't been built at the time of Moses. And then the third point, the if-then theory of history, consequentialist theory of history. If you obey God, you will receive many, many blessings. And if you disobey God, you will be cursed. And the blessings and the curses are just the kind of things farmers would want, because they were a nation of farmers. If you obey God, you'll get good weather, nice sunshine, rain in its season. You'll have children who will work with you in the fields, who will honor God and honor you, their father and their mother. You'll have a wife who will be supportive of you, and you'll have a good life. Right here on earth. They had no notion of personal afterlife at that time. That entered Israelite faith later. But if you don't obey God, you won't have any rain. You won't have any sunshine. Your children will rebel against you. Your wife will nag you. Everything will be terrible. So you better obey God. If you obey him, you'll get good stuff. Then you'll get good stuff. If you disobey him, then you'll get bad stuff. I call that the if-then theory of history. Those are the three major points. Now, because of the second one, the centralization of worship, and the first one too, absolute theoretical monotheism, scholars do not accept the traditional Jewish and Christian view that Moses wrote this. Because if you look at material that probably is Mosaic, such as the song at the Red Sea, when the Israelites passed through the Red Sea and they came out the other end, and the Egyptians pursuing were drowned in the sea, Moses sang a song. He recited a poem. Mi kamocha ba'ilim Adonai, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the mighty. But what he's saying is, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? What a strange thing for Moses to say. So we conclude, if he could say that, he was not a theoretical monotheist, he was a practical monotheist. And I've made this distinction over and over. A theoretical monotheist says there is only one God, and all other gods are false. But a practical monotheist says there may be other gods, I don't know, but we, the Israelite people, worship only one. Moses seems to be a practical but not a theoretical monotheist. Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Now, when you read that in the Jewish prayer book, and every single Jewish prayer assembly quotes that, the way the Lord's Prayer would be quoted in every church service, it's mistranslated deliberately. In the Hebrew prayer book in the synagogue, you've got Hebrew on one side, the original, and then English on the other, because most people are not fluent in Hebrew. So they chant the prayers at the pulpit in Hebrew, but the people often follow in English, so they know what's happening. And it says, Mi chamocha be'elim, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods. But that's not what it says in the translation. It says, who is like thee, O Lord, among the mighty. They're hedging the issue, because modern-day Jews are theoretical monotheists and would be horrified in their prayer book to find a reference to other gods. The religion has changed between the time Moses uttered those words in 1250 BC and the contemporary Judaism, which began shifting from practical to theoretical monotheism, probably about the time of the prophet Amos, about 850 BC, perhaps 800 BC. So that's 400 years after Moses. Religions change and develop. They're not the same as they were 1,000 years ago. The Christianity and Judaism we practice here in modern America is not the Christianity and Judaism people practiced 1,000 years ago, before the Enlightenment, before the Reformation, before the Renaissance. We are Jews and Christians, but filtered through all these modern movements. And people didn't think the way we did 1,000 years ago. They used the same words, but they meant different things. So religion is always, like everything else, if it's going to survive, developing and changing. Although it always claims nothing changes, God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Our doctrines don't change. We believe just what St. Paul believed. It really isn't so. Our take on the world is quite different. So you have to figure out, how do you take the ancient truths of Christianity and Judaism and apply them to the modern world? And that's why we need ongoing priests, rabbis, ministers, theologians, that's my business, trying to stick with tradition, but tweaking it so it can be useful for contemporary life. All right, the book of Deuteronomy, the claim is it was written by Moses. Scholars do not accept that. They say not only was it discovered around 620 BC, but it was written shortly before. And since it stresses theoretical monotheism, centralization of worship in only one place, who probably wrote it? Scholars surmise the priests of the Jerusalem temple. They wanted to centralize worship. First of all, they believed in only one God by this time. But they wanted to centralize worship in a place where they could oversee it. At that time, there were places called Ba'amot. I've talked about these. Local shrines on hilltops all over Israel. But there were often not priests there to oversee it. So God, the God of Israel, was worshipped at those shrines together with nature gods. The average Israelite was a simple farmer. And when he wanted sun and rain, he'd worship Baal, the god of nature that was in place when the Israelites arrived in Canaan and made it Israel. So he says, well, we brought the God of Israel with us. He's a God of history. When there's a historical crisis, we'll worship him and ask him for help. But when we need the creation to give its fruit and its sunlight and its rain, then we'll worship Baal. So those local, B-A-A-L, he was the local pagan god of nature. Those shrines were very dangerous places from the point of view of the priests in Jerusalem. So they write into the book of Deuteronomy that you can only worship God at the central shrine where we can control the purity of the religion. And they attributed those words to Moses, which gives them absolute authority. It's like saying Jesus said something in Christianity. He's the absolute authority in Judaism. So, scholars believe, and I'm teaching this from this point of view, that the book of Deuteronomy was not written by Moses, but in fact was written by priests, probably Jerusalem priests, and then was lost for 30 years and then rediscovered, and it said they had attributed the words to Moses, so they forgot that it had been written by an earlier generation of priests, and they said, well, it says Moses. So it's the ultimate authority. So it was discovered. The king was so impressed by it, he called his troops out, and they went all over Israel, destroying the local shrines. A lot of violence involved there. That's not in the Bible, but they must have been. It says they tore down the Ba'amot, these local shrines. What about all the people who believed in them and worshiped there? What happened to them? We don't know. But the idea was centralize the worship where it can be kept pure. The whole Israelite faith was reaffirmed. A covenant ceremony was held in which everybody got together and said, we will now follow the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' words, when in fact they weren't, but that's what they believed. So that discovery and or writing of Deuteronomy had such an impact on Israelite life that a group of scholars, of historians, decided to rewrite 4 books that had already been written by, remember, what we call the J, E, and P theologians of an earlier time. Some from northern Israel, some from Judah, southern Israel, some were priests. So, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were edited, heavily edited by the Deuteronomic historians who were rewriting them in accordance with the ideas of the book of Deuteronomy. So what we have in Joshua, chapters 1 through 12, and chapter 23 and 24, is a very neat picture of the conquest of Canaan. The Israelites arrive, they cross the Jordan River, Moses dies, he gives the power to Joshua to lead the people, and Joshua leads them in 3 military campaigns: central Canaan, southern Canaan, northern Canaan, and he wins it for the Israelites. And they utterly destroy the Canaanite cities. Whether they actually did or not is a question, but that was the ideal: kill everybody, destroy the cities. Because most people, and that strikes us today as a terrible atrocity, we wouldn't want to do that, but most people fought wars for booty, to get stuff. And the Israelites said, we're different. We are going to offer up the cities we conquer as a great flaming sacrifice to God. Now, they killed a lot of people, men, women, and children, which today we'd be horrified by, and we are when we read this. It's a long time ago, though. But to them, they were fighting selflessly. They were giving it all up to God. Remember, you wanted to give a sacrifice, you killed an animal and burned it, and the smoke rose up to God. Here, you're wiping out whole cities, burning them, and the smoke rises up to God. We call that genocide, and it would not be acceptable when this fellow Karadzic, or whatever his name is, Bosnian Serb, who slaughtered Bosnian Muslims, he just was sentenced by the World Court, and he's old enough so that he'll never get out of jail. And he's a monster, he deserves it. In those days, the standards for being a monster were very different. In any case, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean we should follow it. Certainly not. But we have to read about how their views were in some ways different from ours. So, the book of Deuteronomy influenced the rewriting of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Joshua chapters 1 through 12 and 23 and 24 have been heavily reworked by the Deuteronomic historians. But if you want to find out what Joshua looked like before it was edited, chapters 13 to 22, much more chaotic. Not as neat. Joshua didn't have 3 military campaigns of great neatness and conquer everybody. It talks there about many people, Canaanite people, he didn't conquer. He didn't succeed in destroying the whole country. One reason was the Israelites were very successful in the hill country. But down on the flat plain, the Canaanites, the natives there, some of them had chariots. And they had weapons that were good on the plain, and the Israelites were much better fighters in the hillside. So probably what happened at the death of Joshua is the Israelites had half conquered the country in the hilly regions, but there were plenty of Canaanites still down on the flat plain. And they still had many to conquer, and that's clearly said in chapters 12 through 22, but it can't be said in 1 through 12, because if the Israelites obey God, according to the Deuteronomic pattern, they have to have only success. They have to. So therefore, the Deuteronomic historians rewrite everything to be one success after another, or else they'd have to explain the failure. We saw one failure at the city of Ai last week. They conquered Jericho. Everyone obeyed God, so of course they conquered Jericho. But then they hit the town of Ai. And it says they didn't conquer Ai. Why? Because 2 people, a husband and wife, stole some of the goods that should have been sent up in a great funeral pyre to God in Jericho. Some gold, a nice mantle of some kind, and they hid them in their tent. And God was furious, because that meant they were fighting for their own profit, not for him. So he told Joshua, the reason you were defeated in Ai in the next battle was because they stole that stuff. You better find out who stole it. And they find out, and they execute them. And then they go to A again, and this time they're successful. But as I said, you have a very interesting subtext in Joshua. It gives us a supernatural reason for things, and it gives us a natural reason for things. And it also tells us why were they successful at Jericho and not at A? Because they were obedient to God at Jericho, but not at A. And of course, if one person or one couple steals, it reflects on the whole people. And God punishes everyone. That's the theology, that's the theory. But it also tells us, very interestingly, when they first attacked A, they attacked with 3,000 soldiers. When they attacked again, they attacked with 30,000. So a person who doesn't believe in miracles, well, that's why they won the second time. And the other story is made up at the if-then business. All right, you can read it either way. At another battle, it says the Lord fought for Israel by the Lord threw down great hailstones from heaven on the enemy. As if you can picture God throwing boulders down from heaven. But then it says the enemy was on an incline. And so it's obviously being described as a landslide. The enemy army dislodged the stones with all their marching and carrying on, and there was a landslide and they were buried under the boulders, as if God were sending down great boulders. Moses split the Red Sea. Joshua splits the Jordan just by magic. But it also says there were 12 great stones placed in the Jordan, so he may have dammed the river. So it's very interesting the way you get a story of what happened. The Jordan River was made dry, but why? Because of a divine miracle or because they had put stones in? Very interesting. You can read it whichever choice, you have a choice of how to read it. All right, so we're going through Joshua. We're going through chapters 1 through 12, and I think we've pretty much done that. Let's see. Yes, chapter 10. Chapter 10, we did southern Canaan. Let's look at chapter 10, verses 40 through 43. And a summation of Joshua's second great campaign. The first was against Jericho and Ai in central Canaan, and now we're at chapter 10, and we've been talking about his fight with 5 allied kings. The Canaanite kings realize if they stand alone against the Israelite invader, they'll lose. So they have an alliance of 5 kings, but Joshua, with God's help, defeats them. And then in chapter 10, verses 28 through 39, you have 7 other cities fall, one after another after another. It has to be that way because God is fighting for them because they are righteous. And let's see, chapter 11, verse 28. And Joshua took Makkedah, verse 29. He took Libnah, verse 31. He took Lachish, verse 33. Gezer, verse 34. Eglon, verse 36. Hebron, verse 38. Debir. These are all cities he conquered. And now in verse 40, we have the summation. So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country, and the Negev, that is the southern desert, and the lowlands and the slopes, and all their kings. He left nothing remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed. That's the Cherem in Hebrew, Cherem, a total destruction of the entire population. It claims he did that. But I'll tell you at the end of the class today, when we get to it, why I don't think it actually ever happened. As the Lord God of Israel commanded Joshua. And Joshua defeated them all. Why? Verse 42, this is the point. Chapter 11. 10. No. Chapter 10, thank you. So Joshua defeated the whole land, 10:40. Utterly destroyed all that breathes, wiped out all of them, because the Lord of Israel fought for Israel. And then Joshua returned with Israel, all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal, which was their initial headquarters. when they crossed the Jordan.
In chapter 30, in verse 34, he mentions that they're going to cut the forest down with iron.
Joshua passed on with all Israel from Lachish to Eglon, and they laid siege to it.
Somebody had a chainsaw?
No. All right, chapter 11. Bankruptcy, chapter 11. When Jabin, king of Hazor. Now, in chapter 11, we're beginning the third campaign, northern Canaan. He's taken care of central Canaan and southern Canaan. Now they have to defeat the pagans in the north. Chapter 11. When Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent to Jobab, the king of Madron, to the king of Shimron, the king of Akshaph. And all these kings got together in an alliance to fight the Israelites. And verse 5, chapter 11. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight with Israel. This is a stream in the north. And the Lord said to Joshua, verse 6, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. So he's promised victory before a shot is fired, as it were. No, if they had no chainsaws, they had no guns. Before a sword was wielded. Verse 7. So Joshua came suddenly upon them, a sneak attack, with all his people of war, by the waters of Merom, and fell upon them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who smote them. So once again, the Israelites are totally successful. So they're doing very well. And chapter 12 gives us a summary of the land, of the conquest, and how well he did. And chapter 12, verse 1, now these are the kings of the land whom the people of Israel defeated and took possession of their land beyond the Jordan toward the sun rising, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. And it goes on, it gives us a whole list of the cities and the peoples that the Israelites conquered. But that's the end. 31 kings altogether, 31 cities. That's the end of the Deuteronomic, very neat account of the conquest. So now let's dip into the material from chapters 13 through 22 to see that the original story isn't so neat. Just one sentence, chapter 13, verse 1. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, the Bible says in its delightfully redundant way. And the Lord said to him, you are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to be possessed. So it contradicts. Look back at 11:23. 13:1 contradicts 11:23. 11:23 says, so Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, meaning in Deuteronomy. And Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. So the Deuteronomic historian puts it this way: Joshua conquered the whole land. He must have, because he was obedient to God, and the if-then theology says you can't lose if you do that. But then in chapter 13:1, which is more realistic, it says, there remained yet very much land to be possessed. So you have a contradiction here because you got different authors. One is edited material and one is not. So in fact, the infiltration of the Israelites into Canaan was over an extended period. And it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen with 3 campaigns like this. But the Deuteronomist is nothing except neat. And so he gives us a very neat picture when in fact, it didn't happen in a few years. It took probably a century gradually for the Israelites to displace the other people, who in their turn had displaced the people who had been there before them. This land is being fought over even today. Look at chapter 13, verse 13. Yet the people of Israel did not drive out the Girgashites or the Maccathites, but Geshur and Machath dwell in the midst of Israel to this day. When this was put together about who knows, 1000 BC. This isn't Deuteronomic. Those two groups were still a thorn in the Israelite side, and they lived in Canaan. So the whole conquest actually was a very mixed bag, as history always is, until you edit it and make it very neat. Now, before we pick it up in chapter 23, which is more edited material by the Deuteronomists, I want to just do some highlights of this unedited material, because it's interesting. Some of it we've already touched on. Look at chapter 20. Now, Joshua is dividing the land up. The way you have counties in an American state, this county and that county. Here you have 12 tribes. Actually more, because there's the half tribe of Manasseh and the half tribe of, what's the other one? Ephraim. Joseph is divided into two, so you really had 14 territories, or 13. Chapter 20, he's dividing up the land according to tribal allotments. But remember the cities of refuge and the Levitical cities. Let's first look at the cities of refuge, and this was part of the organization of ancient Canaan. And when you don't have jails, it was a pretty good idea. You see, if you don't have jails, the only way to punish people is through a fine or a death penalty. But here's a third way. Chapter 20. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Say to the people of Israel that when we are dividing up the land, we are to appoint the cities of refuge, of which I spoke to you through Moses." So it's referring back to it being discussed in Deuteronomy, when in fact it probably wasn't talked about till now. It wouldn't make much sense for God to tell Moses something hundreds of years before they had a chance to execute the plan. But to Joshua, now that he's dividing up the land, it does make sense. Appoint the cities of refuge. There are going to be 6 of them. That the manslayer, now what is the city of refuge? The manslayer, somebody who kills another man without intent, unintentional homicide. Could be manslaughter, not murder, but the man's still dead. Somebody who kills a person without intent or unwittingly may flee to the city of refuge. They shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood, because as I explained, in the Middle East, even in Arab culture today, the Jews have given this up, but the Arabs still have it, because they just don't seem to progress in the same way. If I, by accident, kill your brother, accident or no accident, you're obliged to come after me and kill me. And if you don't, what kind of a brother are you? Well, he didn't mean it. No, my brother's still dead. So that's what they still do. So in those days, the Israelites followed that. The avenger of blood, the nearest relative to the killed person, regardless of the lack of intention of the killer, has got to seek him out and kill him. But that's obviously not just. Therefore, you've got to give the killer, the accidental killer, a place to flee from the avenger of blood.